Oh my God! Save me! Save me! Bro! Save me! Save me! I'm bleeding to death, bro. I'm about to die.
When did your party start? Like, when did you guys start partying for your birthday?
We started at 6.
So Tevin came over by himself.
Yeah, he did.
Said a friend of mine invited me over.
Yeah, he said a friend, and I asked him, like, are you sure? Like, is this person okay? Because I don't allow people into my house. I don't. And he was like, oh, he vouched for a friend. But then he came with 2 friends. And I even walked out. I went to my car. You will see it on the camera. I walked to my car. And then he walked in with 2 people. And I was behind them. I was just, and then we walked in.
Okay.
And I asked Tevin, I'm like, okay, are they cool? Like, are they on cause problems?
So they showed up a little bit after Tevin?
Yeah. Okay. Tevin invited them.
Whilst the young man you are about to meet made one small mistake, and it was the kindest mistake a person can make. He trusted somebody he had known for only a few hours, and stood up for that person in front of a whole room of his own friends, without a second thought. One day later, that same person he had vouched for was standing over him at his own front door. Watch one of his friends try to explain to the officers what had just happened.
Tevin really, like, vouched for them. He did. He did. And then as soon as they walked out, pow, pow.
Now here is the part that would piss you off, because while the friends inside that apartment were on their knees trying to keep him alive, the person who pulled the trigger was already down the block, and within the hour he was sitting in the back of a patrol car, acting like the most stressful thing on his mind was that he had missed a nap.
Take you in so you sleep? You're just tired?
I'm tired, bro.
He had just ended a life and was tired. So what could push a person to do that to someone he had met only hours earlier, over nothing bigger than a bruised ego, and then ask for somewhere to lie down? Hold that thought, because we are coming straight back to it, and the answer is smaller and uglier than you are expecting. His name was Tevin Camau, and to the people who loved him, he was simply Nginyo. He was 23 years old, though a few early reports listed him as 22, and he was born in Kenya. Back home, he had been the kind of student teachers point to when they want to show the younger children what is possible. He was a boy who scored 430 out of a possible 500 marks on his primary school national exams, and if you know how those exams work back home, you know that is not a lucky number. That is months of early mornings and late nights, a score strong enough to open the door to one of the country's respected boys' high schools. Then, around 2018, his family made the move to Washington State, and he came over with his mother Veronica and his younger brother Baraka. Tevin was supposed to be the proof that the bet paid off. He finished up at Clover Park High School, picked up his diploma in 2020, and started stacking a life together, the honest way, working as a cashier, and later parking cars as a valet while he studied for something bigger. Those are not glamorous jobs, and that is exactly the point. He was willing to do the small work while he reached for the large dream. Everybody who talks about Tevin says the same handful of things. He was warm, bubbly, had a real respect for people whether they were older than him or younger, and went out of his way to help. His own father remembered him as somebody around whom there was no dull moment, and to his little brother he was less of a sibling and more of a father figure, the one who set the example, the one Baraka watched to learn how to be a man in a new country. That belief is exactly what got him killed. The trouble started at a birthday party. On the evening of August 6, 2023, a celebration for a young woman named Margaret rolled into an after-party at Tevin's apartment building, the Campus Green Apartments in Federal Way. Somewhere in that crowd was a 19-year-old named PJ Langu, and a friend of Langu's known only by the nickname Reaper. Tevin did not really know these two, and by Langu's own account they had only met a few hours earlier that same night. Still, being who he was, Tevin welcomed them in and vouched for them as new friends. The music was going, the drinks were going, the cards were on the table, and for a while it was a good time, the kind of night nobody thinks twice about until it is too late. Then a stranger's fragile pride walked into the middle of it. According to what officers pieced together from the people at that party, the whole thing collapsed for the most childish reason imaginable. Langu was talking, somebody cut across him mid-sentence, and he took it as a personal insult. He got, in the words of a witness who was right there, really upset about being interrupted. The kind of upset that a normal person shrugs off in 10 seconds and forgets by morning. One of the women at the gathering later remembered that Langu had a gun on him and that he made a point of saying he would not be disrespected. Read that back and hold how small it is next to what it cost. A young man at a party felt talked over, and he decided that was worth a human life. Tevin, being the host, did what hosts do. He asked Langu and Reaper to leave. They went, and here is where the people who love Tevin still cannot forgive themselves, because his own friends told him plainly not to go out there. They warned him not to walk those two men out. They pointed at the fact that Langu was worked up and carrying a gun, and told him to just let it go, to stay inside, to let the night cool off on its own. Tevin, in his heart-forward way, brushed the worry off. He said he knew them, he said it would be fine, and he stepped outside anyway. That was the last decision he ever got to make on his own terms. The next morning, Tevin came out of his unit to talk things through with the two men, still believing, right up to the end, that a conversation could fix what a little too much pride had broken. Every second of what happened next was captured by a doorbell camera. You can hear how quick it was in the version of events one witness gave a Lyft driver who had rolled up to that exact spot to pick someone up. Watch the driver try to make sense of what he had just seen.
I went to the destination where I picked the person, and there was three guys that was talking. One of them
On that camera footage, Tevin steps out, there is the sound of two shots, and Langu is seen extending his arms and pulling them back, which is exactly what a person's body does when they fire a handgun at close range. He and Reaper then simply walk off into the parking lot and out of the frame like they had somewhere to be, like they had just finished an errand. Tevin was hit twice in the chest at close range, and somehow he made it back to the door, bleeding badly, calling out for the people inside to save him. His friends did try. They pulled him in, grabbed blankets, pressed on the wounds, did everything hands with no training can do. Here is the reason it wasn't enough. From the moment he was shot to the moment help actually reached him, a lot of time bled away with him, and by the time officers arrived and got him to Harborview Medical Center, the damage was simply too much. A local news crew laid out the bones of it that same night.
That's where they found a 22-year-old man with a gunshot wound who later died at Harborview. Officers took a 19-year-old man into custody nearby.
They found Langu fast, and the way they found him tells you he knew exactly what he had done. He had tried to change how he looked, ditching a red shirt and going shirtless so the description from the camera would not match him. That is not the move of a man who thinks he did nothing wrong. Officers spotted a young man fitting the suspect, and when they searched him, the handgun was right there in his backpack, the same gun from the footage. Listen to how little he had to say for himself once they had him.
Do you want to talk to me about what's going on today? Nothing?
Just take me in. That's it.
Take you in for what?
Just take me in. I got nothing to say.
All right.
When officers spoke with Margaret and the others from the party, the motive they came away with was not money, not a long feud, not fear for his own safety. It was pride, and nothing more.
While speaking with the birthday girl Margaret and her friends, officers learned that PJ had decided to kill Tevin simply because he had hurt his ego by cutting him off during conversations.
And it gets worse when you learn who Langu already was before that night, because he did not stumble into this out of nowhere. He came in with a history that should have kept him nowhere near a gun. He had 3 prior felony convictions on him, for assault and for burglary, and he had recently walked away from a youth rehabilitation facility where he was supposed to be serving out that time. Those convictions meant he was not even allowed to touch a firearm, let alone carry one into a stranger's party. On top of that, by his own account to a court evaluator, he had been partying for roughly 3 days straight with no sleep and no food, running on marijuana, several Percocets, alcohol, and mushrooms. Every guardrail a person is supposed to have was gone, and in its place was a loaded gun and a wounded ego. The part that truly shows how detached he was came at the very end of that arrest. When officers told him he was being charged with murder, he was surprised. He had assumed it would only be assault. He had taken a young man's whole future, taken a mother's son and a little brother's hero, and he genuinely expected to be treated like he had won a scuffle at a party. The law caught up with him, slowly. His bail was set at $5 million. He was charged with second-degree murder and with unlawfully having that firearm in the first place. And he pleaded not guilty at first. The case dragged on for more than 2 years of delays, the kind of waiting that wears a grieving family down to the bone. And then, in November of 2025, Langu finally pleaded guilty to both counts. In January of 2026, a King County judge sentenced him to 240 months, which is 20 years behind bars, a term above what his own attorney had asked for, and firmly inside the range the law allowed. And here is the quiet cruelty in that number. 20 years is a long time to a 19-year-old, and it is nothing at all next to a life. Langu will walk out of prison one day, still a fairly young man, with decades ahead of him. Tevin will not get any of that. He does not get the wedding, the children, the slow, ordinary years of becoming who he was going to be. A family crossed an ocean and bet everything on the promise of those years, and the whole bet was canceled in the time it takes to fire 2 shots. At that sentencing, Tevin's little brother Baraka stood up and spoke for the family. He talked about the move from Kenya, about how his big brother had been a father figure to him, and about a hole that will never close, telling the room that losing those moments is a pain he will carry for the rest of his life. Back in Washington, the Kenyan community had already rallied around the family the way that community always does. His aunt set up a fundraiser to give him a proper send-off, and it pulled in $8,937 from 167 people before they laid him to rest at New Tacoma Cemetery. At his burial, one of the ministers put into words the thing the family was struggling to hold.
So Tevin is not here. This is the soil, the body. This is the house that Tevin used to live in. The real Tevin is gone. The real Tevin is gone.
Before we move on, hold on to one detail from this first story, because you are going to see it again in the next 2. Tevin's friends warned him. They stood right there and told him not to walk outside, told him the man was angry and armed, told him to let it go. The warning was as clear as a warning ever gets, and it came from people who loved him and wanted him safe. He did not ignore it because he was reckless. He ignored it because he was kind, because he could not quite believe that someone he had been good to would do him harm. That gap, the gap between the warning and the willingness to believe it, is where all 3 of these young people were lost. That is our first young man, a boy who crossed an ocean for a better life and lost it on his own doorstep over a few seconds of somebody else's hurt pride. Our second story starts in a completely different corner of the country, down in a small Louisiana city, and it also begins with 2 young men who knew each other long before any shot was fired. Only this time, the person holding the gun was somebody a lot of the internet already knew by name, because he had spent years building a career out of sounding dangerous. To understand the second story, you first have to understand the strange double life at the center of it, because our antagonist here was not hiding in the shadows. He was on your recommended page. He was on the streaming platforms you use every day. He was in his own small way a star, and that is what makes this one land so differently. His name is Kylan Green, and the whole rap world knew him as Calvary Kylan. He came up out of Hammond, Louisiana, a small city with a big violence problem, and his story was the kind that should have had a happy ending. He started making music as a little kid, somewhere around 9 or 10 years old, building a homemade studio out of a phone and a pair of headphones wrapped around a chair in his family's kitchen. There is something almost beautiful about that picture. A child with nothing but a phone and an idea, turning a kitchen into a recording booth. And it worked. The talent was real, the songs took off, and by the time he was 14, he had signed with a major label, turning down other big offers to keep the spotlight on himself. Listen to him talk about it as a kid who could not quite believe his own luck.
Yeah, that shit feel amazing. Like, I'm only 15. Yeah.
Only 15, and already living a dream most grown men never touch. The music that made him was built almost entirely around street life, around rivals, around firearms, around the idea of standing over an enemy. His track list reads like a warning label, one song after another about opponents, and about being shot, and about grabbing a gun. He knew that was his brand. In his more honest interviews, he half admitted he wanted to grow past it, that he wanted to start telling actual stories instead of just playing the tough guy for the camera. But that tough guy image was the product, and the product sold. And so the child kept feeding the character, even as the character started to swallow the child. That is the trap so many young artists fall into. You start out playing a role to sell records, and little by little the role stops feeling like a costume you take off at night and starts feeling like your actual face. And when you sit him down and ask him a simple question, you can hear the gap between the person and the persona open right up.
What's your definition of a gangster?
Take care of your people, make sure people wealthy.
Yeah. So not even all that killing and shooting and all that shit.
I don't be on that shit.
Yeah.
That is a child telling you that being a real one means taking care of people, that it is not about the killing at all. Keep that clip in your mind, because everything that happened next stands in direct contradiction to the boy who said it. Kylan had also lived the danger he rapped about, not just performed it. He had survived being shot more than once, including a graze that could easily have been the end of him, and in interviews he described being followed and targeted, blaming jealousy over his success. He talked about it the way someone talks about weather, like it was just the climate he happened to live in. His own conclusion about his hometown was heavy, and in hindsight, it sounds almost like a prophecy he wrote for himself.
You could die anywhere. Wow. Not safe. Wow.
Now meet the person on the other side of this, because he matters just as much, and by every account he was doing everything right. His name was Germaine Stevenson Jr., and the people who loved him called him Meatball. He was 18 years old. He had grown up partly in New Orleans and partly with Hammond family. He had just graduated from Carver High School, and he was enrolled at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, studying electrical engineering. Think about that for a second, because it is the exact opposite of the path Kylan was rapping about. In a world that kept trying to pull young men down, this one was climbing, and he was climbing towards something as steady and bright as an engineering degree. And this is where the two stories become one story, because both of these young men came out of the same small city, breathed the same air, and walked the same streets. Hammond gave them the exact same starting line. One of them poured himself into music about guns and rivals and standing over enemies, and got rich playing a character built on danger. The other one poured himself into books and a future in engineering, trying to build a life that would carry him somewhere safer. Two roads out of the same place. And the tragedy is that the first road ended up reaching across town and closing off the second one for good. His mother said he was always striving to be better, and she was not just saying the thing that grieving parents say. She meant it, because he had climbed out of real holes to get where he was. He had already survived 2 prior shootings, done a short stint in jail, and fought his way through depression. Any one of those could have been the moment a young man gives up on himself. He refused to take a single one of them as an excuse. He kept going to school, kept his eyes on that degree, kept trying to be the version of himself his mother could be proud of. Here is the detail that turns this from a random tragedy into something that had been building for a long time. Meatball and Kylan were not strangers to each other. According to Meatball's mother, the two of them grew up together in the same community, which sounds almost sweet until you hear the rest, because she says Kylan's group had been targeting her son for a long time. She described a pattern of harassment that followed her family around like a shadow, saying they had even come to New Orleans to pick on her child, reaching across a whole city just to keep the pressure on him. One of those attacks was serious enough that her son spent about a week in the hospital. She has said she kept videos of some of it, because she saw where it was heading long before anyone else did. So this was not two people meeting for the first time at a party, and one of them losing his temper. This was years of one side never letting the other one breathe, and a mother watching it happen and being powerless to stop it. That is the part that should sit with all of us. She saw it. She kept the videos. She knew the pattern by heart, because she had lived inside it for years, watching her son get followed and beaten and hospitalized, watching the harassment reach all the way to another city just to find him. She did everything a mother can do short of locking her grown son in a room, and it still was not enough, because the warning signs a parent can see are not always the ones anyone with power will act on. She was reading the danger correctly the whole time. She just could not make the world read it with her. The day it all ended was an ordinary Saturday, and the ordinariness is part of what makes it so hard to carry. On November 29, 2025, at around 5:15 in the evening, Meatball was sitting inside a hair salon in the Town and Country Shopping Center in Hammond, back in his hometown to see family and his girlfriend. He was doing the most harmless thing a person can do. He was waiting for a haircut. He was not looking for anybody. He was not squaring up with anybody. He was just a young man in a chair on a Saturday evening, waiting his turn like anybody else in that shop. Then Kylan walked in and opened fire. I am not going to sit here and describe what that looked like, because the point is that it did not need to look like anything. There was no argument that justified it, no fight, no threat. The surveillance footage that Meatball's family was later shown, by their account, tells the entire story about how little provocation there was, and his mother put it into words far sharper than I ever could. Speaking to a local station, she said, of the person who did it, that the video shows her son did not bother anyone, that he was simply where he was, waiting to get his hair cut, and that you saw him, you shot him, the end. You saw him, you shot him, the end. There is no gap in that sentence for an explanation to live in. An acquaintance rushed Meatball to the hospital in a personal car, not waiting for anything, just scooping him up and driving, but the injuries were too much, and he was gone before the night was over, 4 weeks short of his birthday, 4 weeks short of turning 19. Now here is the twist that separates this case from almost every other one in this video. Kylan did not vanish. He did not run and hide and make them hunt for him. He ran a short distance to a nearby grocery store, and then he called 911 himself and told them he had shot someone. Because of that call, officers found him and arrested him without any resistance at all. To this day, people argue about what that phone call means. Some see remorse in it, a boy who felt the weight of what he had done the instant it was done. Some see panic, a kid who had spent his life rapping about violence and finally touched the real thing and could not handle the temperature of it. Some see a young man who understood, 1 second too late, that he had crossed a line he could never step back over. Nobody knows for sure which of those it was, and that not knowing is its own kind of heavy, because it means even the person who did it may not be able to tell you why. But think back to that interview, to the boy who said a real one takes care of people, that it was not about the killing. Somewhere between that answer and this Saturday, the character he had been performing for years finally caught up with the child who invented it. He had spent his whole short life renting out an image of a dangerous man, song after song, and images like that do not always stay images. Sometimes they harden into the real thing when nobody is looking. The saddest reading of that 911 call is that it was the first moment the performance dropped, and the actual boy underneath it saw, in plain daylight, what the character had done in his name. He was charged with second-degree murder and with the illegal use of a weapon, and in Louisiana, a second-degree murder conviction carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison with no chance of parole. If he is convicted, there is no number the judge gets to choose, no room to argue for less. It is life, full stop. He was booked and held without bond, and no clean motive has ever been made official, which leaves that whole harassment history sitting there as the only real context anyone has. The police chief refused to dress it up as anything other than a waste of 2 young lives, describing it as a senseless crime where 2 young kids had some type of issue with each other, and saying it was a shame the suspect chose violence to solve the problem rather than some other way. 2 young kids, one dead and one facing the rest of his life in a cell, over an issue that could have been walked away from. The community did not let it slide quietly either. Within days, neighbors, faith leaders, and advocates packed a town hall to talk about how to stop the next one before it happens, because everyone in that room knew there would be a next one if nothing changed. Watch how they framed it, because it is the same fear these families keep coming back to.
Like conversation to curb youth violence on the North Shore. Advocates, neighbors, and faith leaders gathered tonight in response to a recent killing that happened in Hammond. They hosted a town hall at the Black Heritage Center to discuss how to create intervention measures and create some new programs and mentorships. It comes after the death of Germaine Stevenson this past Sunday. Officials say he was gunned down at a shopping center while waiting to get his haircut.
There is something both hopeful and heartbreaking about a room full of people gathering to stop the next killing. Hopeful, because it means a community refuses to just bury its young and move on. Heartbreaking, because These town halls almost always happen after, never before, called into being by a coffin that has already been chosen. All the mentorship and intervention they were planning in that building was exactly the kind of thing that might have reached two young men years earlier, back when the harassment was still just harassment and nobody had picked up a gun yet. The care arrived. It just arrived one funeral too late. And through all of it, Meatball's mother has kept her focus on the one thing everybody else keeps forgetting, which is that the harm never stops with the person on the ground. She said she just wants it to be a lesson to everybody, that people do not know who they hurt in the process, that it is not all about the person you think you are targeting, and asked what about the family you leave behind to grieve. She is thinking about her son, but she is also thinking about Kylan's mother, and about every family that gets pulled into the crater one bullet leaves behind. She said the word for what was done to her son plainly, with no softening. She called it pure evil, pure hate, and she is the one who has to live inside that sentence for the rest of her life, in a house with one fewer plate at the table. That is two young lives now, both taken by someone who was no stranger at all, someone who came from the same streets and the same story as the person they killed. Our third case is the heaviest of the three, and it is heavy for a specific reason. The man at the center of it had already done exactly this once before. He had already been caught, already been convicted, already served his years for taking a life, and the state of Texas had just handed him his freedom back. Let me introduce you to Larry Dwayne Reed, because you cannot understand the horror of what he is accused of in 2024 without first understanding what he had already done, and, just as important, what a whole series of people whose entire job was to stop him chose not to do. Reed's story starts, as far as the public record goes, back in June of 2012. He was 17 years old then, still a young one himself in the eyes of the law, when he took part in a shooting at a house party in Arlington that left an 18-year-old named Obeth Hernandez dead, and another young man wounded. He pleaded guilty in 2014 and was handed an 11-year sentence. That, right there, is the first place a lot of the families involved feel the system failed them, because 11 years for a young man's life felt light from the very start, and it would turn out to be lighter still because he would not even serve all of it in a way that kept the public safe. Put yourself in the shoes of Obeth Hernandez's family for a moment. They lost an 18-year-old at a party, watched the person responsible take a plea, and were told that 11 years was the price. Even that felt like too little to them. What none of them could have known, sitting in that courtroom back then, was that the same young man would one day be accused of doing it again, only 3 times over, to a whole family in another part of the same state. The first failure was the sentence. Every failure after that one just built on top of it. But it is what happened inside prison that should have changed everything, and did not. In March of 2021, Reed got hold of a phone he was never supposed to have, attacked the man sharing his cell, and then did something almost impossible to believe. He broadcast the aftermath on social media, standing over his cellmate and showing it off to the world, treating a violent assault like content. Local news later got the footage, and the reporting on it lays out just how badly the ball was dropped.
Texas prison officials say Reed had just beat up his cellmate and live-streamed some of it to Facebook via an illegal cell phone. Reed serving an 11-year sentence for murder when this...
Here is why that clip matters so much, and why it is the hinge the whole third story turns on. Simply having that phone was on its own a separate felony. This was not a gray area. A former corrections officer who spent 17 years inside that system said the state already had everything it needed to add years onto his sentence for it. Years that might have kept him locked away past the point where the next tragedy ever had a chance to happen.
The ball got dropped.
Sherry Siegelman spent 17 years as a correctional officer in the Texas prison system and says having a cell phone in prison is a third-degree felony, punishable by 2 to 10 years in jail. She says the state had sufficient evidence in their hands to elongate Reed's sentence, potentially preventing those killings.
The ball got dropped. Say that phrase again and think about everything hanging off it. That case was investigated, and then it simply died in a drawer somewhere. He faced administrative discipline inside the prison, and nothing more. No new charge, no extra time, no additional years for a felony that was captured on video and streamed to the public by the man committing it. Stop and think about how many people had to look away for that to happen. A prison caught a violent man with a phone he should never have had. That same man used it to assault his cellmate and put it online, which means the proof did not have to be dug up, it was volunteered, sitting there in public for anyone to save. A former officer with 17 years on the job looked at it and said flatly that the state had enough to keep him locked up longer. And still, somewhere in the machine, the decision was made to treat it as a house matter, a rule broken rather than a law broken. Every one of those choices probably felt small to the person making it. Stacked together, they added up to an open door. So on December 13, 2023, Larry Reed walked out of prison a free man. Remember that date, because the next one lands about 6 weeks later, and 6 weeks is all the warning the world got. Now let me tell you about the 3 people whose lives he is accused of ending, because they were not names on a police report. They were a whole world, 3 separate universes of people who loved them, and they happened to be in the same room on the wrong night. Monique Elaine Smith Glenn was 29 years old, and she was the heart of the home. She worked as a caregiver at an assisted living facility, the kind of job you only take if you actually care about people, spending her days looking after those who could no longer look after themselves. Her co-workers remembered her for her compassion and her laugh, the sort of person who made a hard shift lighter just by walking in. She was a mother of 3, a woman of faith who loved gospel music, and she had married her husband in early 2022, building the family life she had always wanted. Her husband was Jarrell Drayon Glenn, 31 years old, and his story is more complicated than hers, the kind of story that lives in 2 places at once. To his family, he was a devoted father who showed up for his kids and loved his wife. At the same time, he was known to move in street circles, and his social media leaned heavily on showing off cash and luxury, the kind of public display that can quietly draw the wrong kind of attention from the wrong kind of people. He had also been connected to a serious charge back in 2019 that never turned into a conviction. He was, in the end, a man living in 2 worlds at once, one built around his family and one that carried its own risks. And on that night, the second world came looking for the first. The third victim had no business being anywhere near danger. Shannon O'Shea Jones was 29, and he was a barber. He had been cutting hair since he was a little kid. He had recently gotten his license and was building up a mobile business, going to people instead of waiting for them to come to him. He was the kind of man who gave free cuts to school kids and to families who could not afford it, which tells you everything about the size of his heart. His own family called him a community servant, a father of 2 young ones who was finally settling into the life he wanted for himself. He came to that apartment for one reason and one reason only. He was there to give somebody a haircut, the same simple, decent thing he did for everyone. Look at those 3 lives for a moment before we go any further, because this is the cost the dropped case never counted. A caregiver who spent her days lifting other people up. A father living in 2 worlds who was still, to his own children, just dad. A barber who cut hair for free for kids whose families were short on money. 3 separate circles of people, 3 sets of parents and children and co-workers and friends, all of it humming along on its own, none of it aware that a clock had started the day a prison chose to write a felony down as a rule. 6 weeks. That is the distance between a free man walking out of a gate and 3 worlds ending in 1 room. On the night of January 25, 2024, at around 8:30 in the evening, everything those 3 people had built collided with everything Larry Reed had never stopped being. According to the police account of that evening, Reed forced his way into the couple's apartment in Arlington's Chatham Green Village. Investigators say a disagreement with Jarrell came first, and that Jarrell was shot first, and then Monique and Shannon were killed as well. I am going to leave the details of that room where they belong out of this video, because there is nothing to be gained from walking anyone through it, least of all the families who have to live with the real version. What you do need to know is the shape of it, and the shape tells you the motive. This was not a robbery. Nothing was taken. Police have framed it as a targeted attack tied to high-risk activity rather than a random break-in, and Reed knew at least one of the people inside. He did not wander into the wrong apartment. He went to that one. And that single fact is what should keep you up at night, because a random killing is at least random. There is no way to see it coming. This was the other kind. This was a man who knew where he was going and who was going to be there, moving through the world with the same willingness to take a life he had shown a decade earlier, and then again from a prison cell. The danger did not appear out of nowhere on that January night. It had been the same danger the whole time, just waiting on the other side of a gate, that opened 6 weeks too soon. And here is the part I have been dreading telling you since the start of this section. There were 2 young ones inside that home when it happened. They were not physically harmed, and they were later released safely to family, and I am grateful every time I say that sentence. But they were there, in that home, on that night, and no child anywhere should ever have to carry out of a room what those 2 carried out of that one. That is a weight they will be setting down slowly for the rest of their lives. And it is the part of this story that should make all of us angriest about the 6 weeks that never should have been. Reed fled the scene in dark clothing, and for about 2 weeks he ran. Investigators built their case from tips and from a witness picking him out, and they worked out that he had ties down in Mississippi. On February 6, 2024, U.S. Marshals and local authorities found him hiding in an attic in Greenville, Mississippi, tucked away in the highest corner of a house, and he surrendered without a fight. A local station summed up the arrest as plainly as it can be put.
Also looking into this morning, Arlington police have arrested a man in connection with a triple homicide. Police have charged 29-year-old Larry Reed for capital murder. Police found 3 adults shot to death inside of an apartment on Chatham Green Lane on January 25th. The suspect was located all the way in Greenville, Mississippi yesterday and then was taken into custody there.
He was extradited back to Texas to face capital murder charges, and because these cases move slowly, there was still no public trial resolution as this was being put together. I want to be careful and fair here, the way we always try to be on this channel. These are still allegations, and Reed has the right to have every piece of this proven in front of a jury before anyone calls it settled. But the facts that are not in dispute are damning enough on their own, and they all point back to that one dropped case in prison, the felony phone that was never charged, the years that were never added, and the 6 short weeks of freedom that followed his release. If any of this feels familiar, it should, because Texas has walked this exact road before. Long before Reed, the state set free a man named Kenneth McDuff, who had already been convicted in a triple murder and who went on to take more lives after the system handed him parole. The years are different and the details are different, but the shape of it is the same. Warning shape, a person who had already shown everyone in plain sight exactly who they were, released back into the world by people who had every reason to know better and every chance to keep him where he was. History does not just repeat here. It leaves a paper trail, a name from decades ago that everyone in that system should have known, and it still was not enough to make anyone hold the gate shut. So look at what these 3 stories share, now that you have all of them side by side. Tevin Camau opened his door and vouched for a young man he had known for a matter of hours, and that young man ended his life over a bruised ego at a party. Germaine Stevenson sat in a barber's chair in his own hometown and was killed by someone he had grown up beside, after years of being harassed by that same person's circle. Monique Glenn, Jarrell Glenn, and Shannon Jones were together in one apartment on an ordinary night, and a man fresh out of prison, a man the system already knew was dangerous, is accused of taking all 3 of them at once. In not one of these cases was the danger a faceless stranger in the dark. It was a guest who had been let in. It was a neighbor who had never let go of a grudge. It was a killer who had been let back out. That is the quiet warning I promised you at the very beginning, and it runs through all 3 like a thread. The threat almost always had a name and a face the people already knew, and in more than one of these stories, the warning signs were sitting in plain sight long before anyone got hurt. Somebody flashing a gun over hurt feelings. Somebody who had made a whole career out of sounding violent and had been harassing his victim for years. Somebody who had already done this once and never stopped being who he was, streaming his own violence from a prison cell for anyone to see. The signs were there. They are almost always there. And if a person in your life keeps showing you over and over that they are willing to hurt someone, the kindest and hardest thing you can do is believe them the first time, not the last. Rest in peace to Tevin, to Germaine, to Monique, to Jarrell, and to Shannon. Every one of them was somebody's whole world, and every one of them deserved to grow old and boring and safe. If you know a young person who keeps making excuses for someone dangerous in their circle, someone whose temper or whose history keeps getting waved off as no big deal, share this with them. It might be the one conversation that gets them to trust the warning sign the first time it shows up instead of the last, and that might be the thing that keeps them out of a story like one of these.